everyone, my name is Thomas Cruz and I'm the Director of Communications at Queens Community House.
Is Abbie LeWarn. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm the Assistant Director at the Queens Center for Gay Seniors. And I'm here with one of our members. Rich, do you want to introduce yourself and maybe give us some background?
My name is Rich Wandel. My pronouns are normally he, him, although it's not something that I care about that greatly. You can call me anything you want. My background is, well, at this point, I'm like 75 years old, so I've been around a little while. And my activism, my LGBT activism, started before they used the term LGBT, as a matter of fact. And I'm a former president of the Gay Activist Alliance in the 1970s, and generally like to shoot my mouth off.
Well said. So yeah, I think this is a great opportunity to have this conversation. Abbie, you and I, we spoke offline about how how Rich is, has an incredible story to tell and has a lot of lived experience. And aside from that, I think, and Rich, I want to get your initial take on this. We're in the middle of a pandemic, and the past year and change has been pretty crazy. I'm sure there's no arguments there, but I would say that people who've gone through this, like, we haven't really had an opportunity, like an outlet to really express what we've been going through. We were just kind of like tossed into it with no real opportunity to say, okay, this has made me feel this way, and this is what I'm going through right now. And I think now, where it seems like we're seemingly headed towards some sense of normalcy, it's a good time to maybe take a step back, exhale a bit, and say, okay, wow, let's reflect on this past year and change. What are your thoughts on that, Rich?
Well, I think that this past year, it's close to a year and a half, I guess, at this point. And the reaction to it, the impact of it on a personal level, I think has varied widely. It has varied widely from one person to another. It has varied widely from one community to another. And in addition to the personal issues that may have arisen of things such as isolation or economic stability, things of that nature, it has also impacted, along with what else was going on, understanding of race and how it affects people's economic abilities, among other things. And also in terms of the LGBT community, it's affected us in terms of, I think it's impossible for any LGBT person who was around in the 1980s to not be making comparisons with what we went through at that time. All right. So there's that aspect too. It's really so multifaceted.
Yeah, definitely. Rich, we were talking about yesterday about how there's kind of been like an awakening of activism during this time, whether around Black Lives Matter, class, and all the different issues going on right now. And you were around in the 1980s when kind of that activism also boomed around LGBTQ issues. And so we were kind of curious what that was like to get involved in that time and what motivated you to really step out and be outspoken in a time when it was really hard to speak freely about AIDS and speak freely about being a gay man.
Well, of course, my primary public activism was actually in the 1970s, was pre-HIV. In the HIV crisis, obviously I was very aware of what was going on. Like so many people, I lost friends and I lost a mother, actually, at that time. Let me put it this way. Let me tell you just one little story to give an idea. My lover at the time, Hans, we weren't living together, but we were, and we'd only been together for several months. But I had fallen hard, to say the least, wonderfully so. But of course, at that time, there was no recognition of any family connection there. Even the idea of hospital visitation was not, even in New York City, I was in New York City at the time, even that was not guaranteed until the Obama administration. And this, of course, is before that. We're talking about the Reagan administration. Of course, I knew he was close to death. But on the day that he died, the only way I found out about that was because I went to visit him. It happened to be at Bellevue Hospital, because I went to visit him, and I was told that the desk you go to get the pass to go up and visit. And I don't really remember much about that day, to tell you the truth. I have an image in my head of standing at that counter and being told by the person behind the counter. And then I have no memory for hours after that. I believe I just wandered aimlessly around the city. And there was no, certainly ultimately I got support from other friends, but there was no official support. There was no, when I went to his funeral, I didn't even know the family and just sat quietly. And there were other funerals also that I went to at that time. So that was the atmosphere. There was a sense for me of being incredibly lucky in terms of the disease itself. When HIV was first being discovered, I was not living in New York City. I was living in a small city in Pennsylvania, where it would take a little while for HIV to get to, although of course it ultimately did. And by the time I returned to New York a year or two later, the means of transmission was known. I mean, the method of transmission. I don't mean the virus, but how it was being transmitted. So I was able to do something to protect myself in that way. I also was a member of something called the 800-Man Study, which was sponsored by GMHC at the time. And what they did, it's once they knew how it was being transmitted, and the idea, of course, was to convince government or everybody else to allow education about the use of condoms and how it was transmitted. And they divided the 800 men into three groups. One, they used the method of don't do that, you're going to die, be afraid. The middle group was you can have fun with condoms. And the third group was you can have fun with condoms and here's films to show you how to do it. No surprise at all, the most effective was that third group. I was in the middle group of you can have fun with condoms. It was totally ignored, of course, by government. Any education about condoms was actively and successfully opposed within New York City, and even more so, obviously, in the Reagan administration. And in that, it is somewhat similar to COVID. In COVID, we had the federal administration, not the city or state administration in this case, but the federal administration, doing everything they could to pretend it didn't happen, to pretend to keep all the money flowing to people who already had it, and to not give a damn about who did or didn't die. There are differences also in how one felt targeted. In the AIDS crisis, it was specifically gay men and early on also Black immigrants who were specifically targeted. COVID, of course, is more general than that. So on the one hand, with COVID, the overall numbers of people who have been ill and who have died is I'm pretty sure higher than in the HIV crisis. But in the AIDS crisis, it was very targeted to that one or two populations. Also IV drug users was another group targeted. And so there was the sense of being under assault I think was very different for that reason. There were many people who, within a matter, early on in the crisis, it was virtually a 100% mortality rate until they got some drugs to combat it. And even the drugs, the early drugs, AZT, prolonged it, but you knew you were going to die. And there were many people whose entire group of friends, within a matter of months, was wiped out. Early on, the time between learning that somebody had it and their death was often a matter of weeks, and certainly no more than a couple of months early on in that crisis, with the clear understanding that the federal government just didn't give a damn at all. I mean, the blood on Reagan's and later Bush's hands is mostly forgotten by people, but not by people in our community. As compared to COVID, I do know a handful of people who have died. In my case, nobody terribly close. But at the time of HIV, I knew a lot more people who were a lot closer to me. I was not a club person, so I was not one who, like my entire crowd of friends, was totally wiped out overnight. I was fortunate in that regard too, but still sufficiently enough to see. I mean, the sense of people dropping like flies all around you was very real.
Rich, I have a question because I think it's just so interesting to find the parallels between like the AIDS epidemic and the COVID pandemic, and I'm curious because you were talking about like leadership, right? How would you assess from your vantage point the reception or just of like the people and how they were back then with AIDS versus COVID here? How would you assess the people, not necessarily leadership, but the people?
Well, we really didn't talk about it with AIDS outside of our own community. There was so much bad information about it in the wider community that people feared us, I think. And within the community, I'm sure within the LGBT community, there were different groups having different experiences. I do not want to say that my personal experience is absolutely universal and nobody had any other different experience than I do. All right, that kind of oversimplification, I think, in addition to being inaccurate, would be insulting, and I don't want to do that. All right. For myself, there was an underlying fear because it was, and the fear in my particular case, because by the time I got back to New York, the means of transmission and how to prevent it was known. All right. It was not so much a fear for me of coming down with HIV myself. It was more a fear of who will be next and how important will that person be or not be, including my lover at the time, who was already diagnosed with HIV when I knew him. So it wasn't a matter of will he get it? It was a question of when will he go, I mean, initially, the first term for the disease was GRID, gay-related immune deficiency. All right. So initially, they were declaring it as being a gay disease. And in fact, in the U.S., the first cases were also within the Haitian immigrant community. There was an enormous amount, as time went on, an enormous amount of guessing and sometimes really weird, where did it come from kinds of things. Some of them trying to find a group to blame, others not doing that so much, but just being wildly insane about where it was come from, including in the gay press. In New York, the newspaper at the time was the Native, who it would be an exaggeration, but I'm tempted to say almost had a bi-weekly crazy theory to propose. They were big, particularly on the green monkey origin in that case. In COVID, you have similar things. You have people looking around to quickly blame some group, and the prejudice of the day wants to blame Chinese, they'll say, but actually it's all Asians because they can't tell the difference, which actually is in itself absurdity, an absurdity. That racism that makes just lumps everybody together was certainly going on then too in terms of gays. Where am I going with this? I don't know. I'm going off, but so there's that similarity. But there is a difference in with AIDS. It was targeted against specific groups, and especially gay men, and initially Black immigrants. But with COVID, it's more generalized than that. So you don't get that sense. Well, you might if you're Asian. I'm not Asian. I wouldn't be surprised if the Asians Asian Americans do feel that way, but not in my experience.
Sure. Yeah. No. I can speak to that. I mean, definitely. As an Asian American, there is a sense of feeling targeted and blamed, and it's just absolutely misinformed and an excuse for the ignorant to be ignorant, and I think that's probably a consistent sort of tone that exists throughout, right? Like if you go back to the AIDS epidemic, right, it's an excuse for the ignorant to be ignorant, and it's a cop-out in many ways to look for people to blame and then just kind of run with it. And so yeah, it is unfortunate in that regard. So yeah, Abbie, I think you also, we were talking about activism and how it has changed, and like there's like just a recharge, and things have been improved in terms of voices being amplified, and in many ways you can make the argument that it's largely due to the work that was done early on.
Yeah.
Speak to that and then see.
Rich, I know that you had mentioned a lot in our meetings about a lot of people had a fear of the COVID vaccine when it first came out, that it became too quickly, that it appeared out of thin air, even though we know that really isn't true. And you spoke a lot about how the activism work done during the HIV crisis kind of led to that platform for the COVID vaccine to come out quicker. Could you speak to that a little bit more for maybe people who didn't understand that connection?
First, let me say that again, my public activism was earlier, so I do not consider myself as having been an AIDS activist as such. Although, of course, I had many friends and was aware of what was going on, and still goes on about that. And one of the things in terms of HIV, the question was getting the drugs to control, hopefully to cure it, which did not happen, but drugs to control it, which did happen. All right. And there was a great deal of the activism at the time, as notably from ACT UP and from others, of moving that process along. And actually, a fair number of changes were made in the process of approving drugs. And notably something called CRI, Community Research Initiative, which allowed them to more quickly, I think primarily by getting more volunteers and test subjects, to move along more quickly. There was also a great deal of picketing, et cetera, both in terms of discrimination against people with HIV, but also at places like the CDC to get them to move more quickly. Of course, there's one name that's in both of these crises, which is very interesting, all right? And that is Dr. Fauci. Dr. Fauci was during the AIDS crisis also the point man. All right, and at that time, he to a certain extent he was blamed. I don't know if it's fairly or not, but to a certain extent he was blamed for things not moving fast enough. Certainly, there was plenty of anger at the President Reagan, but also the CDC. And with Dr. Fauci being the face of it, was also targeted. And I'm pretty sure that there were changes in protocols brought about by AIDS activism, which later helped us in terms of COVID-19. I think that's very true.
Wow, that's so interesting. I actually did not even realize that Fauci was involved kind of throughout those crises.
He's been there a long time.
Did you find that his reaction to COVID was drastically different than at the time of HIV?
I think so. I think, again, this is just my own thoughts, right? I think he learned better how to deal with a ridiculous administration. All right. In terms of a public face, he was pretty quiet during, he did his work certainly. And obviously was involved in figuring out protocols and AIDS conferences, et cetera, but he did not have the public face that he had in the past few years under COVID. And I think he did an amazing job in the Trump administration of carefully not saying something to get himself fired, but everybody knew where he stood. And I think, and he probably learned some of that in his years of experience between the 1980s and now.
Rich, I want to go back a bit because I think you mentioned that you wouldn't necessarily consider yourself an AIDS activist, or at least starting at that point you were an activist early on. So what inspired you to get into activism and just generally maybe talk a bit about you growing up and maybe an experience that maybe inspired you to become more active and fighting for certain causes?
It's complicated because in many ways, my beginnings of activism were learned in an institution that remains a major enemy of the LGBT community. And that is that I was a Catholic monk. All right, in the second half of the 60s, and until I left in 69 or 70. All right, I come from my family. My parents were certainly conservative. Indeed, they were captains of a local Republican club in Queens. Although Republicans at that time, we're talking Eisenhower Republicans rather than Trump Republicans, but nevertheless. So I come from a conservative background, but I also come from a time when the 1960s civil rights demonstrations were on TV all over the place. I come from a time of watching on the news the police attacks on the Chicago Democratic Convention in 60, whatever that was, the killing of anti-war protesters in Kent State. All of that is part of my background. And then when I went into the monastery, added to that were, we did some tutoring when I was in Hartford, in the monastery in Hartford. We did some tutoring of immigrant children, mostly Hispanic, who were in the 8th grade, and some of them didn't even know the alphabet. And it immediately occurred to me that if somebody by the age of 13 or 14 doesn't even know that basic, it's not their fault. To have, obviously, an education system just pushing them through and not giving a damn had to be what was involved. All right. So while in 1964 I was a vocal Goldwater supporter, by a few years later, as I saw some ghettos I had began to have some understanding. Also, it was a time in the Catholic Church of Vatican II, which was a whole sense of empowerment and change going on. So I did not come out even to myself at all until after that. All right. This is also, I think, hard for people today in the United States to understand that it was not unusual to not even recognize your gayness until you were 20s, or actually I know people who didn't do it till they were in their 40s or 50s even. Okay, and that was not unusual. All right. Certainly there were people who came out much earlier, people who were quote unquote more effeminate if they were men, or more butch if they were women, may have realized sooner. But the ability to deny oneself, to not even allow it to come up into one's brain, was amazing. So by the time I came out at the age of 24, I had been thrown out of the monastery. I wasn't sure at the time why they did that. I've learned by talking to classmates of mine who later on got up into the hierarchy and saw the records to know that indeed it was because they saw I was gay before I did. All right. But I was already in the crowd kind of activist in terms of the war, in terms of starvation in Biafra and things of that nature. So it was natural for me to continue that mindset. And I was, the last monastery I was in was in Union City, New Jersey, which is right across the river from New York City. And I was living in Brooklyn. And I went back one Holy Week, still thinking of myself a Catholic at the time. I went back for the ceremonies and whatnot, but knowing I was gay. And as I came back home, which had me get off at Port Authority, walk through Times Square, to get the train to Brooklyn, there was a demonstration going on because that year and in that summer, there was a great deal of, not unusual at that time, arresting anybody in Times Square who quote unquote looked gay. So there was a demonstration, a combination of the Gay Activist Alliance and the Gay Liberation Front working together in that particular case. And so I joined them. And we marched back and forth, and then we went to the local precinct that was doing it, which is, I think, 30-something street nearby. And then after that, we walked down to the village as a group, banners flying and everything. And when we got there, 8th Street between 6th Avenue and, what is it, University, that's next, whatever's next, was closed off to traffic summertime. And until midnight, it was closed off. So we were dancing in the street, having a good time, and midnight came. And it was time for them to open up the street. And the police intended to do that, and we intended that they would not. We were being influenced by the Women's House of Detention, which was still standing at that time. Some of the women in the prison were cheering us out the windows. And I noticed two things. I noticed that there were some provocateurs who would be far back in the crowd, but throw something over the crowd at the police. And I also noticed that the police would pick whoever was smallest, nearest to them, to beat the shit out of them. And so that was a turning point for me. That is what solidified my sense of being part of this community and a need to be more involved. So at that point, I began regularly going to the Gay Activist Alliance meetings, eventually became their second president.
I also was hoping maybe you could talk a little bit about your archiving work, which I feel like has gone under the radar, so humble in not mentioning it. And I was curious if you've been tempted to archive anything throughout this time as well.
What Abbie is referring to is that I'm the founder of the LGBT archive at the Lesbian and Gay Community Center in Manhattan. And I got into that because, a few years before that was founded, I had been asked by the mayor's office, which would be under Mayor Koch, to be one of 4 people putting together a gay exhibit at City Hall. And then a few years after that, when the community center, under the leadership of Richard Burns, who was the executive director at that time, decided that they wanted to have an archive. They asked around who they could get to do this, and almost everything in that time at the community center was volunteer. There was literally just 3 employees: the executive director, his assistant, and the building superintendent were the only paid people at that time. So Richard Burns asked around and spoke actually to Vito Russo, who was a friend of mine also, and Vito remembered that I had done the exhibit and recommended that he asked me, and I said yes. I'd always been interested in history, certainly, but because I said yes, that's what made me go back to school, because I was aware that although I could learn what I needed to in a variety of ways, to firmly establish it, it would be much better to have a piece of paper that said so. So for that reason, I went back to school and got a master's in history and a certificate in archival management, and established the archive. And began planning it in '89 and opened it in 1990. And I retired from it a few years ago. It is now run by an excellent archivist by the name of Caitlin McCarthy, who is a paid staff member. I never was, who is a paid staff member at the center, and indeed has a project going now on collecting things relative to the LGBT community's experience of the COVID crisis, as a matter of fact. So when I retired from that, I disappeared for a year, because it's not good to have the founder around looking over your shoulder, and then kind of came back in contact and am now, and help when I can, which is, I don't do a great deal, but every now and then we'll help out there.
Rich, when did you cross paths with Queens Community House? How did the Queens Center for Gay Seniors connection start?
After I retired, which again, I'm terrible at dates.
Fine.
Whatever. It's probably, I don't know, it's coming on 10 years already? I don't know. It's before the current, it's before Abbie and before China were there. I knew some people at at Pride House across the street from them, a gay organization. Actually, it's changed hands since then, but a gay organization. And somebody, I think they were doing discussion groups, and at one of them, somebody mentioned that right across the street, located in the Jewish Center, was a senior center. So after stalling in my head, my God, a senior, my God, I was, I guess, looking for people to hang out with a bit. And so I began first going to the lunches there, and then over time adding 1 or 2 of the other regular activities. One of the men's discussion group, occasionally one of their art things or whatever, and their Monday morning history discussion group, which I'm still doing now via Zoom. And indeed, it's been very important, I think, in the time of COVID. For many of us, certainly including myself, there are typically 2 things that I do. Three things that I do with Queens Center for Gay Seniors each week, as well as one that I do with Sage in Manhattan. And that's been very important. I regret, however, that there are a great many people who I was used to seeing at the center that just never made it to Zoom for whatever reason, not having the equipment, not being comfortable, whatever the reason, who have not made it. But even there, I must say that China and Abbie have been very good in kind of passing the word around if one of these people other people is having difficulties or in the hospital or they're doing fine or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, I was explaining to Thomas before we started kind of like how the center really feels like a chosen family. And I think in a lot of ways, because of the HIV crisis, to your generation, how having a chosen family is so deeply, incredibly important, because a lot of people lost lovers, friends, family that, didn't talk to them for X, Y, and Z reason. And why kind of having the center closed during COVID kind of hit hard in that way for people who weren't even there for maybe the classes or the lunch or X, Y, and Z, but just to kind of see each other. And I kind of wanted to ask maybe like, what were your like initial thoughts, like when COVID was happening in New York and, things were starting to shut down? Like, were you drawing parallels in your mind back to HIV, or were you kind of like, here we go again, what is happening?
I think to a certain extent, COVID too, it kind of was a gradual dawning of how long it was going to be. There were several times along the way where we thought, oh, a couple of more months only, and it wasn't true. So there's that. I also want to say, in terms of HIV, I don't think any gay man of the time can talk about the AIDS crisis without talking about the magnificent help and assistance we got from the lesbian community. It is time after time after time on a personal level with individuals. There was the lesbian friend who was taking care of the dying, of the sick gay man, and some of course were very much involved in the political and the demonstrations and whatever, but there was an enormous number who were involved just in taking care of the gay men in their lives. And I think anybody from that time will acknowledge them. In the COVID crisis, again, it's paradoxical that on the one hand, overall, you have many, many more people dying than you did in the AIDS crisis. On the other hand, it just does not have, unless you happen to be in a family who lost someone, of course, there are many such people, it does not have that same feeling of being under attack, I think, that HIV did at the time, and to a certain extent still. I mean,
So I'm curious, with it seemingly heading towards some sense of normalcy. What are you looking forward to? I think now it seems like we're hopefully reopening things back up, right? And getting back to having people in person, maybe those people who were just like not up for the Zoom sort of interactions, right? Maybe they'll resurface and everything will be back to normal. But yeah, what are you looking forward to, Rich?
I think it's going to be a while yet, because the reopening, at least in terms of senior activities, apparently, as far as we can tell, who really knows, but as far as we can tell, it's going to be very restricted in terms of social distancing and things of that nature. And what's important, of course, more than anything else, I mean, the details of being at the center and I don't know, Presbyterian hospital coming in and teaching you something is very nice and very good and all of that. But what it's really about is simply the connection of people. And I think that's likely to still be very restricted for quite a while. I mean, in the center, you'd go for lunch, and I would go usually twice a week. Some people would go every day. I would go twice a week. Of course, some of the people there were going in part because it was a really important part of their budget. All right, and that has to be acknowledged. That doesn't happen to be true for me. The gods have been very good to me in that regard. But I would go there, and theoretically the table would sit 6 people, but you'd crowd in 8 to begin with because these were your friends. And then on some occasions, like the monthly birthday, you'd put 2 tables together and make it 12, 13, or 14, and also circulate among the other tables to a certain extent to talk to people. And I don't see that happening anytime soon. And I think that is certainly for me the most important part of what the center has been.
We definitely hope that we can get some sort of outdoor programming or things started over the summer or the fall so that we can get that personal connection back, because I think it's something that rings true for a lot of our members right now, that, you know, the meals and the exercise classes are great, but that the social connection and feeling like safe in a senior space as an LGBTQ elder, which is hard at a lot of other senior centers, so that it needs to be remade. And
no, that's an important point too, and this has been true for not just in terms of the seniors, but before that also. It is not, even if you're with a mixed group of gay and straight, even if all of the heterosexuals within that group are truly allies, which doesn't happen that often, but even if that be true, it is not the same thing as simply being among ourselves. Kind of freedom. We do indeed have a different vocabulary, certainly a different view of sexuality, even though I suppose many of us are certainly not 20 anymore in that regard. There's a freedom, even in mixed men and women, there's a freedom there which does not exist when you're the minority in a mostly heterosexual group, or even when you're in a truly mixed group of people.
So let's see. I think this is a good question to ask, and maybe we can end it here, Abbie, unless there's anything else that you want to add. But my question is, Rich, what does pride mean to you?
Sure, you got 2 hours. I think, first of all, let me say that I was at the first Pride March. All right. The first Pride March in 1970 was put together as a coalition of the then existing gay organizations in New York City. I'm talking about New York City's Pride March. Obviously, there's also one at that time on the West Coast. And so indeed, it was called the Christopher Street Liberation Day Committee, as opposed to a separate organization that's existed, I guess, since the 80s with Heritage of Pride. Nobody asked for a permit. Nobody asked for a permit. We gathered together in Sheridan Square. At this time, I am a member of Gay Activists Alliance, but I'm nowhere near a leadership position, right? No idea who would show up. And started to walk uptown. The idea was we're coming out of the village to be everywhere, all right? Walking up actually 6th Avenue, which of course means going against traffic, 6th Avenue being a downtown direction, and starting on the sidewalk with, I don't know, my memory is fuzzy, but I'm going to say 30 or 40 people maybe. And as we went up, we kept growing. More and more people were joining us. Police, of course, showed up. We got to be too many. So we started to go into the street and taking over a lane or two on the west side of 6th Avenue and continuing on up. We got up to Central Park. We were going to the Great Lawn, which at that time truly was the Great Dust Bowl. And there's a little rise. And I remember coming into the park and going to there and going up that little rise and then turning around and looking. and being amazed at the numbers, the thousands that had joined us. We knew we were in a safe space. The cops were not going to attack us because there were too many of us, and they don't need that.
Right.
So it was a very free area. There were a handful of people, for example, who took off all their clothes. And there was that kind of freedom. It was certainly a true mixture at that point of men and women. So what does that mean? Pride means just being whoever the hell you are and not giving a damn about what somebody else thinks. And I think that's what pride means, whether you're talking about LGBT pride or pride according to your heritage or whatever it might be. And to allow that freedom. At that time, we would do what was called gender fuck, or many of us would, some of us would. That is to say, they might be a mustached or bearded person, but wearing a dress and walking the streets, mostly of the village. If you were with a friend, you took their hand in public because it was a political act. Maybe you only met him 5 minutes before and will never see him again. It was a political act that you were doing, or kissing goodbye at the subway. And the whole idea of it was to show other gay and lesbian people that they could do it. The whole concept of doing that was not that you were going to convince the idiot cardinal of New York, but that you were going to encourage your brother or your sister to do the same thing, and that's what would bring about change. So pride is being about yourself, and then that spills over into other areas of your life. All right. Granted, I took a ridiculously long time to tell myself I was gay, but once that was done, no way would I go into hiding. It just makes no sense. It just makes no sense. To go into hiding. And people sometimes say to me, because I was always out at work also, and people would say to me, well, yeah, you can do that because look at the kind of job you have. I was the associate archivist for the New York Philharmonic for 20 or so years, an arts organization, in other words. And they say to me, well, you could do that because of the job you had. And I said, you've got it reversed. I have the job that I have because I did that, because I would not work anywhere else. And so pride is about openness. It's about speaking your mind. It's about listening too. Certainly, I think I've always, since college days, had some awareness about what then we would have referred to as civil rights issues. And that's deepened over the years. Certainly, I know more about it now and have certainly still not a perfect understanding, but a better understanding now than I did then. And it is about continuing to learn that way and to continue to discover who you are and your relationships with other people of all kinds.
Well said, Rich. Yeah, I think that's all I got on my end. Abbie, do you have any other follow-ups?
No, that's it. But thank you, Rich. I really appreciate you just
one other thing, and that is in the modern world, we're the area within LGBT that we're painfully growing and learning more about as compared to other times is trans men and women. All right, and certainly even within our LGBT senior center, we have people who don't get it at all. And it is such an enormously freeing thing to learn about this. I'm not a trans person. I'm a cis male. Never had a thought, nor do I have now, that I might be other than that. Although I must say non-binary is a tempting term for me. So that's the issue of the moment. And certainly if I was a trans person, I would be concerned with not getting murdered and other nice little details like that, okay? But on a personal level, it is such a freeing thing for me to increase my understanding about such things. It has an immediate impact on me if I allow it to. And if I embrace and learn what I can, not that it's their responsibility to teach me anything, okay? But the fact is that if I'm open, I will learn something, and it's enormously freeing to do so.
Very important to bring it back to that when talking about Pride. I mean, Stonewall was started by trans women, so I think it's always incredibly important to not let them go forgotten in this time and when we talk about history. And just again, like, thank you for taking the time to talk about this. I think younger queers, as one myself, it's easy to forget kind of the history that a lot of people went through and fought through. And we really appreciate you just taking the time to talk about this.
I think it's great to hear from our participants and just to get their perspectives, because I always like to say that Queens is representative of like all these walks of life, so many unique experiences, and what better way than to really give them the floor to have these conversations and like tell their stories. So again, thank you so much, Rich, and it was great having this conversation. And yeah, perhaps we'll be doing this again sometime soon.
Thank you, Tom. Bye-bye.